Okay, I'm gonna ask you a quick question. Do you think Diavolo from Part 5 is stronger than Part 3 Jotaro and possibly even Part 3 Dio before Jotaro's Rage Amp and Dio's High State? The reason I ask this is sometimes when I scale Diavolo, I look back at these two characters and the minimum being Polnareff from Part 3, and I always say Diavolo's always been like a Silver Chariot plus level character because that's the most information we've ever had on him. However, in a recent VC discussion with my homie Jobber, this guy decides to drop a bombshell on me. I'm gonna quote this verbatim so nobody thinks I'm lying. JoJo 2023 Winter Manga, page 83. The two that seek the arrow. The relationship between the two didn't end with their journey in Egypt. After their fight with Dio was resolved, it was revealed in Part 5 that Jotaro and Polnareff had gone their separate ways, each pursuing the bow and arrow. However, Polnareff was cut off from society by Diavolo's hand. If he had been able to call Jotaro, one can't help but imagine, with the efforts of the now even stronger Star Platinum and Silver Chariot, they might have been able to defeat Diavolo. First off, even stronger Star Platinum, so my previous video discussing that topic is right. Second off, stronger Silver Chariot. My assumption in a lot of videos was also correct. Third off, the do you mean might have defeated Diavolo? So I'm figuring by now you realize why I'm making this video. Not only is outside JoJo sources talking about one of the most interesting what ifs, but is also challenging a lot of previous scaling that we thought was pretty concrete. So not only are we talking about one of the best what ifs in this video, but we're also talking about the new power scaling that could arise from this magazine statement. So if you're interested, stay tuned. And oh, by the way, hello, my name is Metas. Walk with me. So before we get into the meat and potatoes of this what if, the first question we have to answer is, how does this what if even work? Could it even be possible? And thankfully it does, but you have to do a little bit of assuming. Timeline wise, it can happen. Part 4 takes place in spring of 1999, and we know that Polnareff versus Diavolo takes place sometime in 1999. Now if we're lucky, this is maybe winter of 1999, so just before Part 4. So as long as Polnareff somehow contacts Jotaro in the winter of 1999 or maybe late 1998, this what if can happen. But of course, our next problem is, how does Diavolo let, Polnareff call somebody on his watch? Honestly, probably a fluke. That's basically what we can assume here. People are infallible. Maybe somebody in Passion messes up and doesn't catch the phone call signal out of southern Italy. That's the best we can assume here. In the case that somebody asks, well, Metas, would Jotaro even help Polnareff? Yes, he would. This is your war buddy that you went through Part 3 with. If he calls you saying there's somebody out here so strong that not even I, the Silver Chariot, can defeat him, of course Jotaro is going to drop everything he's doing and go help out one of his closest friends. So with the what if questions out of the way, let's talk Jotaro and Polnareff versus Diavolo. So originally back in the day when this what if was presented to me by myself, I thought it was a dog walk. I thought Jotaro would have absolutely cleared Diavolo any day of the week on top of assistance from Polnareff. You have to remember that Jotaro at this time was viciously powerful. This was even before my general idea that Part 4 Jotaro is even stronger than Part 3 Jotaro, which is outright just confirmed in this magazine statement. But even before that, we have to look at the stats. Jotaro is way faster, has way better scaling above Silver Chariot, has one of the best abilities in the series hands down, and is glazed constantly by everybody from Part 3 onwards. You put that on top of what I originally thought, which is just outright confirmed right now, they better Silver Chariot, and it's like, what is Diavolo gonna do? Like, honestly speaking here, how does he even scale up to one of the strongest characters in the entire franchise? It just doesn't seem fair. And it's ultimately worsened by the fact that Diavolo doesn't really have a lot of good feats to begin with. Just a lot of assumptions and chain scaling done off of Polnareff, who we know is objectively weaker than Jotaro. But that recent idea is now challenged, and honestly is way different now thanks to the Winter Magazine of JoJo's. Because of the statement and the implication that there is at least a pretty decent chance they might lose to Diavolo, kind of implies that Diavolo to at least some degree is actually even stronger than we originally thought. How much stronger? Well, if it's a stronger Star Platinum and a stronger Silver Chariot, and there is a margin of error that could possibly lead to Diavolo winning, I would ultimately say, at least at a realistic lowball now, that Diavolo is the strongest Part 3 Jotaro, maybe even Part 3 Dio, with a highball being now that Diavolo being relative to Part 4 Jotaro and Polnareff, who are objectively stronger stronger than their original Part 3 counterparts, thanks to the magazine statement. Then you throw on top one of the best abilities in the entire franchise, that being King Crimson and its time skip and epitaph, and honestly, it kind of makes sense why the magazine phrases it like this. Jotaro and Polnareff might have been able to defeat Diavolo if he was that strong, which begs the question, how strong were Jotaro and Polnareff during Part 4? Well, looking into Part 3 and its scaling, Part 3 heavily implies that both Jotaro and Polnareff are beyond light speeds. Looking at the Hangman fight, the Sun fight, and the numerous amount of Star Platinum stand stat guides, outright confirm that both of these stand users are light speed, and depending on how you scale the Hangman fight, you can possibly get massively faster than light plus speeds. Now, when it comes to AP and durability, this is where it can kind of get subjective. At the minimum, we've seen Star Platinum pull off town level feats easily, and simultaneously see Polnareff be able to defend against light rays that came from the sun, which can be calced anywhere in between large town level to island level in terms of AP. This of course goes back into Jotaro, as Polnareff has said Jotaro and Star Platinum are physically stronger than him and Silver Chariot, meaning that feat would also apply to Jotaro. Then you have to add this very subjective Part 4 multiplier that just kind of insinuates that Jotaro and Polnareff are just stronger in Part 4 compared to Part 3. So in conclusion, Jotaro and Polnareff in Part 4 are an incredibly powerful duo. However though, thanks to the Winter JoJo magazine, Diavolo gets to piggyback off of most of this scaling, making this fight pretty even now, with Time Eraser / Time Skip and Epitaph really carrying Diavolo, as Jotaro's time skip is pretty abysmal, at the best being 2 seconds, at the worst less than a second. So how does this fight play out? In the absolute worst case scenario where Diavolo wins, I see Diavolo winning in one of few ways. The primary one being that of Time Erasure and Epitaph being too hard for Jotaro and Polnareff to overcome. You have to remember here, the nature of Time Skip or Time Erasure, whatever you want to call it, and Epitaph are allowing Diavolo basically to skip over damage and critical blows, meaning that a lot of attacks would just be wasted if Diavolo can time that right. And in that timing, he could easily end up killing Polnareff or Jotaro when they're not expecting it. However, this is on the assumption that both Jotaro and Polnareff don't figure out the ability while teaming up with each other and are really not playing in their favor with the powers and abilities they have. And to be fair, is incredibly likely here, with a powerful stand like King Crimson more or less confusing a lot of the opponents it faces. This is not entirely unlikely. And with Diavolo being so equal in power to these two, you could argue that this is probably going to happen more times than not. Absolutely insane. I didn't think I'd be ever in a million years arguing that Diavolo could beat both of them simultaneously. Now, in this worst case scenario with Diavolo beating both of them, what happens to the rest of the JoJo timeline? In my opinion, I think Part 4 goes terribly. With no Jotaro there, the investigation for Kira is much worse. Hell, it might not even happen, meaning that Kira potentially wins all of Part 4. And while you could say Josuke could probably fix many of the problems within Morio, when it comes to the grander ones, I don't think he'd be able to do it, not by himself. When it comes to Part 5, Diavolo is unchecked. He's basically able to do anything he wants, even if the Speedwagon Foundation comes to Italy to figure out what happened to Polnareff and Jotaro, he'd be able to use Passion and their money and their influence in southern Italy to do whatever they want. There's no way the Speedwagon Foundation is going to be checking Diavolo and Passion. There's just no way. And while yes, Giorno is there, without the Requiem arrow from Polnareff, there is no concrete way to beat Diavolo. Honestly, he wins. Now, when it comes to Part 6, things get very, very interesting here. Diavolo and Kira's goals are infinitely smaller compared to Pucci's. If Pucci proceeds with the Heaven Plan in some way, and now outright giving up because Jotaro's been dead for a very long time now, he could potentially find Dio's sons as a last measure to see if maybe they have the potential to bring back Dio, or potentially find out what Jotaro saw back in those early days in Part 3. And with the ability of Underground thanks to Versus, this is possible. So with Pucci learning of the Heaven Plan directly from the past, Pucci will probably go through the Heaven Plan with nobody being able to check him because he doesn't need Jolene here. Giorno probably didn't join Pucci's group here because it's not in his character, and with the Speedwagon Foundation not knowing what Pucci's doing, there's no reason to call Josuke, and that's only on the case that Josuke knows of the Speedwagon Foundation and somehow Part 4 figured itself out, which I highly doubt. And on the off chance that, of course, Pucci, like I said, doesn't go through with the Heaven Plan, that's still 2 out of 3 villains that live and do some crazy damage to the world, all because Diavolo scales to Part 4 Jotaro. Crazy. Now, in the case that we are are not glazing the hell out of Diavolo's abilities, and Polnareff and Jotaro are actually playing to their advantages and are trying their absolute best to defeat Diavolo, which I think is way more likely than the previous scenario. How could Jotaro and Polnareff beat Diavolo? Well, I think it's very simple. We know that in the original timeline, Polnareff eventually figured it out, however, it was too late. But with Jotaro being there and probably prolonging the fight for much longer than it originally was, more likely than not, both of them would figure out that Diavolo has a time-related ability. So both of them would be trying to counter it as best as they can. Remember, Jotaro only has a half a second to 2 seconds of time stop as of right now, and probably only uses it to readjust or reset Polnareff if something deadly is going to happen to him. However, because he hasn't used it in a very long time, which I'm going to immediately say Polnareff is going to make fun of Jotaro for it, Diavolo ends up actually catching up to Polnareff and probably heavily injuring him, just like before. With Polnareff in a critical state and Jotaro probably remembering the past, this is where I think Jotaro actually gets his rage boost again. If Diavolo is around Jotaro's level and Jotaro then surpasses his current state with a rage amp, which is equivalent to basically being a vampire, so fun fact about that looking back in part 3, either A, his time stop is prolonged in an enraged state, or he's just overall too fast for Diavolo to react to, so immediately after time skipping, he just completely speed blitzes him and heavily injures Diavolo to such a point that time erasure or epitaph are not going to save him. Ultimately, Jotaro does the finishing blow and Diavolo is dead. Now, if you think the rage amp is too egregious here, there is an alternative win scenario here as well. With both of them having so much stand experience by this point in the series and having numbers on their side, Jotaro and Polnareff try their best to corner Diavolo and put him in a scenario where time skip and epitaph won't save him. Kind of like an all roads lead to failure kind of scenario. More than likely how I see that playing out is that 2-second time stop is really effective in very short distance, so as long as Jotaro's close to him, I think Diavolo loses. However, Jotaro and Polnareff win, what happens to the rest of the JoJo timeline? There isn't any immediate change. More likely than not, Polnareff still has a mission in Europe to stop the drug trade. After the source is now gone, Polnareff probably goes after the smaller ones, meaning that Jotaro goes back to part 4, or starts his adventures in part 4, and Kira is defeated. With the only thing I see really being changed is maybe Polnareff makes Jotaro think differently about time stops, so he trains it a little bit more. But other than that, part 4 basically stays nearly the same. However, that can't be said for part 5. With Diavolo no longer being there, a power vacuum probably ensues in which a new boss is crowned, potentially meaning that Giorno and Bucciolati have a much easier time in part 5 than originally. How the entire part plays out, I don't know. But what I can say is Giorno probably just still has gold experience, as Polnareff still kept the Requiem arrow for himself after the events with Diavolo and Jotaro, which leads us to part 6, where some of the most dramatic change takes place. Just like the original timeline, when Jotaro loses his memory disc and stand disc to Pucci, the Speedwagon Foundation uses its resources in order to help Jolene to beat Pucci, and in this case, they call on Polnareff. With Jotaro helping Polnareff in the past, I can't see but Polnareff helping Jotaro here in this scenario, and of course helping Jolene. At the latest Polnareff shows up is sometime before the Green Baby and Pucci fuse, meaning that there's a whole extra person who's on the same level as Jotaro preventing the Green Baby to fall in the hands of Pucci, potentially meaning part 6 might just straight up end very early because of Polnareff. Honestly, I think it's the most realistic option here. I have no idea who Pucci's gonna call upon, at least during that point of the story, to help defeat Polnareff, because this Polnareff knows what he's going into, unlike Jotaro. He knows that Pucci has the ability to take away memories and stand abilities away, so Polnareff will be playing cautious here. In the absolute worst case scenario here, with Polnareff dying early, the timeline kind of resets into itself and part 6 plays out the same, with some minor changes and different attitude after the death of Polnareff. Now, this is where the good ending could be concluded. However, I want to go into a little bit of speculative territory. For whatever reason, if Polnareff didn't defeat Pucci and somehow the timeline stays nearly exactly the same, just with Polnareff, adding to fights and adding to dialogue and kind of changing a lot of the character of the other protagonists here in part 6, and we somehow get to the Made in Heaven fight, there is a possibility that a really cool fight could potentially happen. Remember, Polnareff still had the Requiem arrow, and it's been in the possession of the Speedwagon Foundation for a pretty long time now, so the chances are pretty high with a scientific foundation doing research on a very, very powerful object that they figured out that a stand arrow can actually reveal dormant power within a stand user if they have the latent potential for it. Potentially meaning in a last-ditch effort against Made in Heaven Pucci, Polnareff uses the arrow, or Jotaro uses the arrow, or maybe even Jolene uses the arrow to equal out the playing field. Now, it's a little bit fan-fiction-y, I know, but it is a reality that could potentially happen, and the only reason why I bring it up is there is a potential reality where, just like in part 5, this version of Polnareff still pricks his hand on the arrow and still gets Chariot Requiem Requiem, potentially meaning that part 6 is done even faster because nobody would be able to beat Chariot Requiem. Of course, this would be a controlled Chariot Requiem because Polnareff is not crippled and is worthy of the Requiem arrow. Honestly, I think Jotaro and Polnareff could beat Diavolo here. The reasons being is they just have numbers to them and they have a hell of a lot more stand experience than Diavolo, as I think combat experience and use of stand ability in strategizing against your opponent, like part 4 Jotaro does, play a much bigger role here than stats do if all of them are at least relative to each other. And with that edge, I would give it to Jotaro and Polnareff. A lot could change if Jotaro did end up helping Polnareff. Good and bad, depending on if you think Diavolo could beat them or could not beat them. So it's crazy all around in terms of power scaling, in terms of what if they win or what if they lose. I'm honestly so happy that this statement exists within the Winter JoJo magazine because it makes one of the best hypothetical scenarios even better, at least in my humble opinion, which is not really humble. I really love this scenario. It's so cool. I love it. Just the sheer thought of Jotaro and Polnareff fighting Diavolo is so cool in my mind, and what could happen afterwards, win or lose, is so interesting. So with that all being said, like, comment, share, subscribe. Follow me over on Patreon if you want to consider supporting me. Stay hydrated, and I will see you in the next one, ladies and gentlemen. Deuces.